It's kind of interesting being up here because you don't know until you're up here that the lights blind you. And you literally cannot see beyond the edge of the stage. Hilo is a special place. It is where I grew up. It is where most of you have come to live. But once upon a time, there was no Hilo. There was no island. There was only ocean. And for more than 1,000 miles in every direction, there was nothing but water. But on the bottom of the ocean floor, there was a volcano. It was erupting. And it took many, many years for that volcano to eventually emerge from the ocean and form islands. And in fact, the volcano is still building the island that we live on. But once that lava hit the surface, immigration started. The first immigrants were things like fish and algae, crabs that might have come on bits of logs that were floating in the ocean. And the wind blew. And the wind blew spores, its seeds, and it blew birds to Hawaii. And they made this home. And over the years, forests grew. Sandalwood, koa, hapu. And one day, out of the ocean came a double-hulled canoe. Now, to the Polynesians who first came here, this must have been a wondrous sight. You can imagine, you have been on the ocean for a month, 2 months. Maybe your food is running out. You're relying just on the fish that you can catch. And suddenly, in the distance, you see clouds. Maybe you see some birds flying. And then you see the island, and it rises like a green emerald out of the ocean. You have found a new home. Since the Hawaiians came, there have been many other immigrants. The British came in their big ships with their big white sails. Whalers, missionaries, and sugarcane growers. And with sugarcane, they needed workers. So then another great immigration to Hawaii occurs. The sugar plantations bring in the Chinese. And when they brought the Chinese, they only brought Chinese men, no women, which is why there are so many Chinese Hawaiians in Hawaii today. Because many of the Hawaiian men had left to be on whaling ships, and a good many Hawaiians left for the Pacific Northwest to become lumberjacks that left women behind. And so we had Chinese men, we had Hawaiian women, we ended up having babies. Later, we brought in Japanese. The Portuguese came in as skilled labor. From Scotland, we brought in management. We brought in Filipinos, we brought in people from Puerto Rico. And everyone had a different language. Everyone had different food. Everyone had a different culture. And they had to get to know each other and to share their language and share their food and create pidgin. And believe me, when I was little, there was a lot more pidgin spoken than there is today. But it grew a community. And from that community, we have much of the roots of what is Hilo today. Now, I'm an immigrant too, although I am a Leithead, and my mother was the third generation of a Portuguese family, and my father was born in Makiki. I was not born here. I was born in southern Japan on the island of Kyushu to a Japanese woman and an American serviceman. And at some point, my mother decided that I would have a better opportunity she gave me up for adoption. So when I was 4 years old, I went to a foster family in Washington Heights, Tokyo, to learn English. And to give me added incentive, every time I spoke Japanese, I was punished. So I arrived in Hawaii speaking fluent English and refused to speak any Japanese. But my coming was big news. It was believed that I was the first child of Japanese American ancestry to be adopted in the state of Hawaii. So when I landed in Hilo, the newspaper reporters were there and photographers were there. So I ended up on page 1 of the Tribune Herald, as well as Hawaii Hochi, the Japanese language newspaper, because this was a big deal. And I got to meet my 2 new brothers, Scott, who was Japanese Norwegian, and Les, who was English, German, Hawaiian, and Japanese. And actually, my brother Les is descended from Keku Haupio, a famous warrior in Hawaiian Mo'olelo. And they greeted me at the airport with flower leis. And my mother, because she didn't know whether I could speak English or not, had an interpreter ready to speak to me and interpret. So it was a great delight for them to learn that I could speak English. But they wanted to Americanize me. So she also had a beautician friend there, and they were going to whip me over to have my hair permed so I would get curly hair, which I guess was the style back in 1956. And I got off the airplane and I already had curly hair, thanks to my American serviceman father. So no beautician. However, they wanted to incorporate me into the family, make me feel welcome. So one of the first things we did is we went to Food Fair Supermarket, which no longer exists. If you are familiar with downtown Hilo, where Subway and the laundromat are located, that was Food Fair. And the whole family went shopping. I sometimes think it is a mistake to take children into a supermarket. I was 4. I had just gotten off the plane. And I stared in amazement. The most wonderful food in the world was in that supermarket. I only had it once in Japan, but I knew it was delicious. So I have a loud voice. At the top of my lungs, I screamed, "Bananas!" My 2 brothers were horrified. They quickly distanced themselves from me. They didn't want anyone to know the screaming child was their new sister. And my parents wanted to quickly make me go quiet, immediately handed me a bunch of bananas. Well, we had more aisles to go through in the store. And they had a Japanese food section. So I would point at, "That's good, that's good, that's good." And my parents wanted to keep my volume of the voice down, make me happy. So we went home with a grocery cart full of food that they had no clue what it was they had bought. They didn't know what the name of the food was. They didn't know how to cook it. Luckily, they had Japanese friends who explained what the dried fish that they had bought was, or the dried seaweed, and what to do with it. And I think it may have been the start of my father's quest to learn how to cook foods from multiple countries. My father, Arthur Leithead, was a school principal. And in fact, he was the school principal at Keaukapa Elementary School for 17 years. That's where he ended his career. I want to tell you a benefit of being the principal down there is you get invited to every baby luau in the community. And back then, the luau's were fabulous. Nowadays, they don't have as much of the opai. They don't have as much of some of the other delicacies. You rarely see wapihi nuts. But I had all of that because we got to every big. And my mother, who was a third generation Portuguese, was the cafeteria manager at Hilo High School, which meant then there was only, other than St. Joseph, which in the minds of people who went to Hilo High didn't count. Hilo High, alumni if there's anybody from St. Joseph out there. But Hilo High was the only high school in Hilo. There was no Waikea, there was no Keau. There was no Kamehameha School's Hawaii campus. Everybody went to Hilo High School. And that meant that my parents, between the two of them, they knew everyone in the community. We lived on Kaumana Drive. My parents knew the names and the families of every single house as we drove up Kaumana. That was the Chanakanas. The Arujos lived over there. That's Mr. and Mrs. Bright. Oh, and across the street, that's the Ono Poultry family. And above us are the Matos. But they knew everybody. They belonged to the Kaumana Kumiai, which is kind of Japanese for community association. And it was a small town. They knew everyone. And I'm going to tell you why we were up in Kaumana. My great-grandfather Costa, who came over to work on the sugar plantations, wanted to be independent. He had a pig farm just mauka of the Hilo Armory. Where Kulana Na'au'au sits today was my great-grandfather's pig farm. And the state of Hawaii needed the land to put up some state structures, so they offered him a deal. You give us the pig farm, we give you 20 acres up in Kaumana. Well, he thought that was a pretty good deal, because his pig farm wasn't that big. And the Portuguese were familiar with grapes back in Portugal. So in Kaumana, my great-grandfather planted grapes, and he grew the grapes and he sold them to the Sorrel family who made wine. And we used to export wine from Hilo to California. This is before California had Napa Valley. However, Prohibition came along and it kind of killed off the industry here in Hawaii, especially when the government people found out that the Sorrels were still making wine against the law. But grapes grew on. So great-grandfather divided his land amongst his children. Those children divided their land, and my mother got a piece of the property of Kaumana, and that's where they built their home. And from Kaumana, you could see all of Hilo. We had a big picture window, and we had everything in the yard. Two kinds of mango, bananas, vaivi. We had a vegetable garden. We had chickens and ducks. The ducks were because my dad liked salted duck eggs. The chickens, we had our own eggs. We also had bunny rabbits. And then later, all of this ended up, our family ended up selling when my mother was ill and we needed the money. But I grew up in this family that was so connected to the community. Some of you may remember that I ran for office some years ago. Well, I got elected not because of who I was, but because of who my mother and my father were. People voted for me because they knew my parents. And this is 20 years after my parents had passed away. Because my mother died when I was 18 and my dad died when I was 20. But everybody remembered them and they felt, well, they were good people, so the daughter must be good people too, so they gave me my vote, and that's how I got elected to office. But they left me this legacy of community service. When Kapoho erupted, it was my mother who went to open the cafeteria at Pahoa and made coffee and food for the people who had to evacuate. In 1960, when the tsunami came, my father was a civil defense volunteer, and he went door to door in Keaukaha knocking on doors in the middle of the night to wake people up to tell them they had to get out, that the tsunami was coming. My mother went to Hilo to open up the cafeteria, to cook food for the evacuees. And they had to leave us home alone in order to do this. But it was the sacrifice they made. It was the lesson that we learned about being part of a community, about caring for your neighbors. And it's something that I have kept all these years later. So what I would say to you is, if you don't know your neighbor, go introduce yourself. You don't have a community association? Make one. Because community is what binds us and what helps us create a good place for our children and a good place for ourselves. The other thing is that you never know when you're going to need help. So you should know who your neighbor is. I hope that you go out and make sure you know your neighbors. Make sure you know the parents of your children. This is a relatively small island. It's a small community. It's better when we know each other, when we care for each other, when we make the effort. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me. And if we ever have an opportunity, I like to talk, I would love to be invited back. And then I can tell you about the 1934 Babe Ruth baseball game.